Hi, everybody. We are talking today about identifying variables. So this is actually something that we talked about last time, but we're going to go a little bit more in depth today. And yeah, so here we go. When we, again, are working with this wheel of inquiry, again, we start at the top, we do the observe, we wonder, we find something that we're kind of curious about, which leads us to our question. Again, we want to make sure that our question is testable, meaning that there's something that we're changing and then something that we're actually gathering data on, something that's being measured. And eventually, within the next day or so, we'll start to get into this develop hypothesis part. So again, these are some examples of some testable questions. Does the amount of light given to a plant affect the length of the roots? Again, I'm changing the amount of light and I'm measuring the length of the roots. It's testable. Does the type of food I give Timmy, the turtle or tortoise, affect his energy level? Again, I change the amount of food and somehow measure his energy. It could be by how far he walks. It could be by how much he is engaging with, how many times he goes to see who's ever at the door of the cage, whatever that might be. And then, does the type of energy drink I consume affect my heart rate? Again, I change the type of energy drink and measure my heart rate or heartbeats per minute. So all of those, again, are testable questions. We've got something we're changing and we've got something that we're measuring. We started talking the other day about these first two, independent variables and dependent variables. And again, you learned about this in 6th grade science. So we're kind of just doing a little bit of a review with these. When you have an experiment, you only have one independent variable. You have one dependent variable, but you have many controlled variables, or sometimes we call them controls. And we're going to dive a little bit deeper into that. Again, an independent variable is the variable that you decide to change in your experiment. So it's the thing that you're actually like testing and changing. Dependent, again, I think dependent data, both start with D. That's the variable that's measured as a result of what you're changing. So again, if anything you're collecting the data on, that's dependent. Controls or controlled variables, these are all of the things in your experiment that you want to keep the same, meaning you do not want them to affect your results. A lot of times, once you've figured out your independent variable, because there's like a lot of different choices with independent, and you pick one, if you go back, you can kind of use those other possibilities for independent variables as a list for making your controls. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. So again, controls are things that you want to keep the same. So let's do a couple of practice problems here. So let's take a look at this picture, and I'm going to give you a couple awkward seconds to do that. So take a look at the picture. It looks like we're doing some sort of experiment with plants, right? We've got little blue drops, which are representing water. And all of them looks like they all have 4. We've got light. All of them have light, same distance, same color light bulb. One thing that you should notice here is this one here doesn't have any green drops. This one has 2 green drops. This one has 4. And this one has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay. Oh, it says it right there. Smart. And what those little drops represent is fertilizer. Okay, so it looks like each different plant here is getting this different amounts of fertilizer. That right there is going to be what we are testing in this little experiment, is the amount of fertilizer. So independent variable, amount of fertilizer, green drops, meaning that's what we're changing from one plant to the next. So again, that's our independent variable if we were, again, doing this little experiment. Dependent variable, again, is what data is being collected. Now, again, it doesn't really say here, there's no clues as to what this picture is indicating of what's being measured, but I want you to think right now, if we were changing fertilizer amounts, what are some things that we could take data on as a result of different amounts of fertilizer? And I want you to think a little bit before I tell you some answers. What could we collect data on if we're changing the amount of fertilizer? All right, enough thinking time. These are just some examples. We could collect data on the height of the plant or how tall each plant grows. We could count the number of leaves that we get from each plant. We could count or measure the width of each plant. We could measure the thickness of the stem in each plant. We could measure even the thickness of the leaves. We could measure the mass of the plant after a certain number of time or days. So those are all things that we could potentially measure. We want to pick one. Okay, we want to pick one. We don't want to do all of these things. I mean, we could, but that's a lot. So let's say we decide to measure the height of the plant. So now that those variables have been chosen, we can put them together and make a really good question. Like, how does the amount of fertilizer affect the height of the plant? So we've got, again, our independent variable, which is amount of fertilizer, and our dependent, which is the height of the plant. And it's all in a nice, neat little testable question. Okay. Now we got to figure out controls. So again, if we're only changing from one plant to the next, the only thing that we're changing is the amount of fertilizer, and we're measuring the height. Everything else we want to keep the same. Okay, so controls are variables, things that could affect our results, but we don't want them to. We don't want them because the only thing that we want to affect our results on how tall the plant grows is the amount of fertilizer that each plant gets. And again, with control variables, there's not just going to be one. There's going to be a lot of them, right? So these are things that could potentially affect our results, but we do not want them to. Again, we only want the little green amount of fertilizer to be different. So type of plant. If I had like some plants that were one type and some plants that were another type and another type, and we were changing fertilizer, that would not make our experiment would be faulty. Our results wouldn't be reliable. Amount of dirt, type of dirt, amount of light, amount of water, temperature that these plants are grown in, the way the seeds are planted, how many seeds were planted together, type of fertilizer. Those are all things that could affect the results of how tall the plant grows. And we don't want them to, because we've decided to choose amount of fertilizer to test and not those other things. And we could change the amount of dirt and measure the height. But for this particular question, we don't want the amount of dirt to affect the results because we have chosen, like I said, the amount of fertilizer. So all these other things, we want to keep the same. And that's what controls are. Let's take a look at this picture. This one's kind of similar. So it looks like we're doing something with plants, right? What do you notice that's different between this right here and this right here? Think for a second. Kind of hard. It actually took me a little bit of time. The light bulb color is different, right? So we've got a yellow light and we've got a red light. So that's what's being changed from one of these plants to the other. Now it's already also kind of showing you the effects of what happens when you change the different color light bulbs. So again, light color is the independent variable. We've got yellow over here and red over here. Dependent is what could be taken, data could be taken. And again, there's lots, but we're choosing plant height. So we'd have to measure that. Control variables, again, are things that could affect the results, but we do not want them to. We only want the light to affect the results. And so we would want to have the same amount of water, same type of water, same soils, amount of soil, same temperature these plants are kept in, same time we measure. If I measure one in the morning, the yellow plant or the yellow light plant in the morning and then the red one at night, that could affect our results. So those are all things that we would want to keep the same. I'm going to give you one more example. Let's say we want to run an experiment with little Timmy. Now, by the way, if you don't know who Timmy is at this point, you have not been watching the videos. I've had a couple kids that are like, you have a tortoise? That means you're not watching these and you should be ashamed. No, you shouldn't, but you should really watch them because it's the lesson that you would be getting if you were actually in here and in school and it was normal. Blah. Anyways, all right, so we got Timmy here. Timmy's like, I want to be in your science class. I want to be involved in a science experiment. All right, Timmy, here we go. let's say we want to ask this question, because this this is a question that my kids have asked me. They've said, who's Timmy more afraid of? Is Timmy more afraid of me, or is Timmy more afraid of Rory or you, Mom? And I'm like, well, I could tell you the answer, but let's try to make this into a scientific question. So just as this question is stated here, who is Timmy more afraid of? Is that a testable question, the way it's phrased? Think about it. It's not. The way that this is phrased, who is Timmy more afraid of, is not testable. But we can actually rephrase this so that we can or could run an experiment on this. Because again, I can't just ask Timmy. I can't just say, hey, Timmy, who are you afraid of? He's just going to look up at me and do nothing, right? Because turtles or tortoises can't talk. So we have to change the way the question is phrased so that we can change something and how we can gather actual data. Now, I was thinking about this. What kind of data could you gather in measuring if something is afraid? And this is where you kind of have to think about things when you're thinking of a question. What do you do when you're afraid? I know for me, when someone scares me, I fall down. I like collapse in fetal position and scream. Timmy doesn't do that. He doesn't scream. He does kind of hiss a little bit. So that could be something that we could align with being afraid. I know too, when like Rory tries to bite my feet and I get scared that she's going to hurt me, I run. I run like the wind, which isn't that fast, but I run and she usually ends up catching me. But that's kind of a normal response for when something is afraid, is they try to get far away from whatever is scaring them. So we could actually take that, because that's something we could potentially measure, is how far or even how fast something runs. So we can take this poopy question here that's not testable and actually manipulate it so that it is testable. So this is what I came up with. Does the person or animal near Timmy on the ground, very specific, affect how far he walks away or runs or scoots in 1 minute? I've got something I can change, the person or animal near Timmy and how far the distance he walks away or runs away within a minute. So again, which of those, using this question, which would be my independent variable? I want you to think right now. Using that question, what would my independent variable be? And I want you to think right now, what data would be collected? What would be the dependent variable? Think, think, think. I feel like Dora the Explorer, if you've ever watched that, where she asks a question and then she just like stares at you and then answers. Kind of doing that right now. All right, here we go. So independent variable, what's being tested, what's being changed is the person or dog. So if it was me, Abe, Anne, or Rory. So that's what we're testing. What we are measuring is the distance that he walks away from in 1 minute. Again, because we can't just measure being afraid. So the distance he walks in 1 minute would be our dependent variable. We can measure that. Controls. Again, controls are things that we would want to keep the same. We would want these things to not affect our results of how far he goes. So I would want to do this in the same environment. I would want to handle little Timmy the same way prior to putting him on the floor in front of each person. So if I like shake him a little bit and then put him in front of Abe, well, of course that's going to affect the results versus if I like gently put him down in front of me. Same distance away from the person. So if I start Timmy super, super close to me and then really far away from Abe to start with, that's going to affect the results. Same time of day, maybe in the morning he's all sleepy and he's not afraid of anything. And then at nighttime he's like, has a lot more energy and is more, I don't know, out of it a little bit or kind of crazy. If I test Abe in the morning and me at night, that's going to have an effect on the results. Same materials on the floor. If I put some lettuce away from Abe and he sees that, he might travel farther to get that lettuce versus if during my test there's no lettuce. So that could affect the results. And then the same way to measure. if I measure with a tape measure for me and then a ruler for Abe, that's going to affect the results. So these are all things that we don't want to affect the results. If we're truly wanting to see which person actually makes Timmy more scared, or which one is going to cause him to go the farthest away from us, we want that to be the only thing that affects our results. We don't want it to be any of these other things. I mean, again, these could be other experiments, but if we're only changing the person, or if it's Rory or whatnot, we want these things to be kept the same. So here's what you're going to do. I want you to try this out on yourself, meaning I want you to go to the Google form and see if you can, from a question, pick out independent variable, dependent variable, and then some possible controls. So again, it's going to be the Google form is very similar to this. You're going to get a question like this, and you're going to have to think about, and from that question, pull out independent, dependent, and controls. Okay. Just like I said on, I don't even know what day it was. Yesterday was whatever, on Tuesday. Yes. Just like on Tuesday, I need you to try on those Google Forms, because if I get the information back and everybody completely fails it, that means that I have to spend more time reteaching, and we can't move on. So please try your best, and don't just guess. Actually try your best so that I can use that information to guide kind of where my lessons need to go. So yeah, anyways, I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you later. Bye.